I thought inheriting my grandfather, his ranch would finally give me the peace I had been chasing for years, far from the city's endless rush of deadlines, traffic, and cold apartment walls. When I first drove up the gravel road and saw the old red barn standing against the horizon, something inside me loosened for the first time in years. The porch still creaked the way it did when I was a kid, and I could almost hear my grandfather's voice drifting through the wind, telling me stories about the land, about how every acre had its own history. This place wasn't just property, it was blood, sweat, and memory. I promised myself that I would protect it no matter what. The very first day I arrived, the air still smelled of fresh hay and pine, and I remember thinking how quiet everything was compared to the chaos I had left behind. I was unloading boxes from my truck, humming to myself, when I noticed a woman walking up the drive with the sharpness of someone arriving to serve. Bad news! She wasn't dressed for a friendly visit. No, she had a stiff blazer, a tight bun, and a clipboard clutched to her chest like a weapon. Without even a hello, she scanned me up and down as if I was trespassing on my own land, and then she spoke in a tone that dripped with authority she hadn't earned. "You're late. The new owners were supposed to take possession last month." At first, I thought I misheard her. New owners? This ranch had been in my family for generations. My grandfather left it to me in his will, and the deed was signed and filed at the county office. There was no sale, no pending buyer, no discussion. I told her plainly, this ranch isn't for sale. My name's on the deed. She narrowed her eyes, lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer, and introduced herself, Karen Whitfield, president of the neighborhood HOA. She spoke as though it meant something here, as though this stretch of country, ranchland, was just another suburban cul-de-sac she could bully into submission. Her words still ring in my ears. The HOA already approved the sale. "You're not welcome here unless you pay your dues and comply with our rules." She flipped through her clipboard, shoving a stack of so-called documents at me, filled with jargon about transfer approvals and assessments. My stomach dropped when I realized she wasn't joking, she was serious. Somehow she believed she had authority to sell my land without my consent. She leaned forward, lowering her voice like she was offering me a deal. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. There's money to be made and you're in the way." I felt my chest tighten with a mix of rage and disbelief. I tried to laugh it off at first, half hoping she was pulling some elaborate prank, but the look in her eyes made it clear she meant every word. I told her, "This land isn't under your HOA. It's county property. Exempt, and always has been. You need to leave." But she didn't flinch. Instead, she gave me a smile that felt more like a warning and whispered, "If you don't play along, you're going to regret it." Then she turned on her heel and walked back down the drive as if she had just declared war and was certain of her victory. That night, as I sat on the porch with the crickets chirping in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't bluffing. I replayed her words over and over, wondering how someone could be so bold, so entitled, as to claim they had already sold a home that wasn't theirs. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory. "Don't ever let anyone take this land from you." And as the wind moved through the trees, I realized I was staring down the very kind of fight he had always warned me about. The harassment didn't take long to begin, and it came in the form of bright, orange notices nailed to my gate before the sun was even up. The first one claimed unauthorized livestock present on property, with a $300 fine attached in bold letters, but I only had my grandfather's 2 old horses grazing peacefully in the pasture. I tore it down and laughed bitterly, but by the end of the week, 3 more appeared. One said my barn was out of compliance with HOA structure codes. Another fined me for illegal mailbox installation, and one even accused me of running a commercial farm without approval. Each slip of paper was more ridiculous than the last, yet the official-looking stamps and letterheads were enough to confuse my neighbors. I tried to ignore them, but whispers started traveling through town like wildfire. At the hardware store, people who used to smile now gave me sideways looks, muttering as I passed. One older man, a neighbor 2 miles down, finally pulled me aside and said quietly, "She's done this before. She pressures people until they sell cheap, then flips the land to her developer friends. Most folks don't have the stomach to fight her." His warning hit me like a cold slap, because I realized Karen wasn't just being difficult, she had a system, a pattern, and I was just her next target. That night I sat at my kitchen table staring at the stack of fake fines, each one like a bullet aimed at my willpower. Things escalated when I came home late one evening to find strangers walking across my pasture, measuring and pointing as though they already owned the place. My headlights caught Karen standing with them, clipboard in hand, telling them, "Don't worry, the seller is being uncooperative, but the HOA will resolve it soon." My blood boiled as I stormed out of the truck. "This is my land," I shouted, "and you're trespassing." Karen folded her arms, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Correction, it's HOA-managed land, and you're the one trespassing. You can leave quietly, or I'll have you removed." She stared at me like she had already won, and before I could even respond, she pulled out her phone. She actually called 911. My chest tightened as she rattled off lies, telling the dispatcher that a dangerous squatter was refusing to leave private property. Within minutes, the distant hum of sirens turned into flashing red and blue, lights painting the side of my barn. A deputy stepped out of his cruiser with his hand resting near his holster, scanning me like a suspect. "Sir, we got a report you're refusing to vacate this property," he said flatly. My voice shook with anger and desperation as I pulled my grandfather's deed from my pocket, along with the will and tax receipts I had carried just in case. My hands trembled as I held them out. The deputy studied the papers carefully, glancing between me and Karen, who stood smugly behind him, arms crossed like she had orchestrated the perfect trap. For a moment, I thought he might actually side with her until his brows furrowed and he muttered, "Ma'am, this land isn't under your HOA. You don't have authority here." Karen's face twitched, but she quickly snapped, "He's forging documents. He doesn't belong here." I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, every word she spoke fueling the fire inside me. The deputy gave me a hard look, as if to say this isn't over, then turned back to her and warned, "If you keep filing false reports, you'll be the one in trouble." But the glint in her eyes told me she wasn't done. That night, after the deputy left and the strangers had driven off, I stood alone in the driveway staring at the shadows stretching across the pasture. The fake fines were one thing, but Karen's willingness to weaponize the police proved she would stop at nothing. I thought about my grandfather's stories, about how he had fought off developers who once tried to carve up this ranch, and I realized that same blood ran in me. But unlike him, I wasn't just fighting greed. I was up against a woman who had turned manipulation into an art form, and who had the neighborhood convinced she was untouchable. I knew if I tried to fight Karen head-on, she would keep twisting the story until the sheriff, the neighbors, and even the county started doubting me. So instead, I spent nights buried in old records, combing through zoning maps and dusty county files until my eyes burned. That's when I found it, an official county document signed almost 20 years ago. My grandfather had fought this exact battle when the HOA first formed. The developers had wanted to rope his ranch into their little suburban kingdom, but he had stood his ground and won. The document clearly stated in bold letters, "Exempt in perpetuity." My chest tightened with relief and fire at the same time. Karen couldn't just bend this law. This paper was a shield, and I was ready to wield it. But holding the proof wasn't enough. Karen was cunning, and she thrived on intimidation. I needed to flip the game on her, make her show her hand where everyone could see it. So I called her bluff. I reached out with a voice that was as calm as I could manage and said, "Fine, let's talk about selling. Bring your buyer, bring your paperwork. Let's do this properly at the ranch." The silence on the other end lasted, just long enough for me to hear her smirk through the phone. She thought I was surrendering. She thought the fight was over. And that was exactly what I needed her to believe. 2 days later, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel, and her shiny SUV rolled into my driveway like a parade float. She wasn't alone. Two men in slick suits stepped out with briefcases, their faces lit with the kind of greed I had seen before in city boardrooms. Karen strutted ahead of them, high heels stabbing the dirt, her clipboard thicker than ever. "Finally," she announced like a queen addressing a subject, "you've come to your senses. Let's get this signed and finished." One of the men pulled out a stack of contracts, slapping them onto the hood of her car, and for a brief moment, I felt the full weight of what she had been planning. She wasn't just threatening me, she was orchestrating fraud. I didn't waste a second. I pulled the folded county document from my jacket and placed it right on top of their contracts. "Before you sign anything, you should know the truth," I said, my voice low but steady. The men leaned in, scanning the stamped signature, the words that cut through Karen's scheme like a blade. Their faces drained of color almost instantly. "This ranch was never part of your HOA," I continued. "It cannot be sold by you now or ever. And if you move forward, you'll be guilty of fraud." One of the men swore under his breath. The other rounded on Karen, his voice shaking with fury. "You told us this was clear. Do you have any idea what kind of charges we could face?" Karen's mask cracked in an instant. She lunged for the document, shrieking, "That's fake! He's lying!" But I had already texted copies to the buyers, the sheriff, and even a handful of neighbors. The proof was everywhere now. The men shoved their contracts back into their briefcases, glaring at her like she had dragged them into a nightmare. "We're done," one spat. "And you'd better hope we don't lose our licenses over this." They stormed off, their tires spitting gravel as they fled down the road. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her face a storm of rage and panic, then turned on me with eyes so sharp I thought she might actually strike. "This isn't over," she hissed, every syllable like venom. Within a week, the sheriff's office delivered a notice of investigation, this time addressed to her. Fraud, falsification, harassment, the words I had waited to hear for weeks, were finally attached to her name. But even then, she didn't vanish. Neighbors told me they saw her circling my property at night, her headlights sweeping across the fields like a predator searching for prey. Every time I sat on the porch, I half expected to hear the crunch of her tires, to see that smug face trying once again to twist reality to her will. And in the silence of those nights, I realized exposing her wasn't the end of the battle. It was only the beginning.